Hello, everybody, and welcome to the COO panel for the PWMA conference. My name is Paul Thompson. I'm responsible for the Hong Kong and Philippines market at JP Morgan Private Bank. As a market manager, it's incredibly important that we hold the utmost intent when we think about regulations and meeting our regulators' requirements. Regulations continue to evolve and have seen considerable changes, especially since 2008. We're now moving into this very exciting time in financial services where the technology that we see impacting other industries is now starting to come to regulations and financial services. If you could pull up my slide, please. As you can see, the RegTech market is expected to grow incredibly fast over the coming years. As you can see, in the last decade, we've seen a 500% increase in regulations. To put that into perspective, you can see a regulation change anywhere around the world almost every 7 minutes. To put that into further perspective, by the time that we're finished this panel today, you would have seen 7 to 8 different regulatory changes. Now, as a financial service or financial institution, how do you keep up with all of these changes? Why is this such a big focus as well? And as you can see from the slide, 2019, the global RegTech market is approximately $5.3 billion. In 5 years, by 2026, it is estimated that that market is going to be greater than $33 billion. I think we all know that this is an incredibly fast-growing market and something us as financial institutions are excited about the change that's coming. But what's everyone focused on? So let's go to my next slide. As you can see, what are the key RegTech offerings that are coming for asset and wealth management? No surprise, the one at the top is anti-money laundering and KYC. This is one of the most important things that RegTech providers are looking to solve today. The next one that we all know is very important is to follow suitability. And then also regulatory mappings as well. We are starting to see additional products now that are coming into scope that have never been in scope before, like crypto. Then one of the other things for us to think about as well is, how do we make sure that we control all of this? What's on the other side? If RegTech gets implemented at a firm, what does that get plugged into? Today, hopefully with our panel of experts, we're going to address some of those questions. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce the panel that we have put together for you today. First, Florence Coy. Florence is Chief Operating Officer of Asia Pacific and Deputy Head of Private Wealth Management for Goldman Sachs. We also have James O'Callaghan, who's a partner at KPMG. And one of James's key focuses is advising wealth management companies here in Asia. And we also have Jeff C. Jeff is the Chief Operating Officer of Asia for Pictet Wealth Management. So first off, thank you for everyone for joining us here today. So James, I'd love to start with you. Obviously you advise some of the largest financial institutions here in Asia. And what I'd like you to maybe paint for us is kind of what the future holds, right? If everything goes the way that it started to look and that you do see the growth that we explained, what does the future look like for regular RegTech here in Asia?
Excellent, thank you, and good morning on this wet Hong Kong day. So if I could just put my slide up. So what does the future of RegTech and how are banks going to use it in the future? Now, this is a very busy slide, and it's really just to demonstrate that there's a lot going on. But we know that regulatory and compliance challenges that we all face every day, and actually I think Paul summarized it really, really well around onboarding, sales practices and suitability, source of wealth, disclosures, etc. That's not going away. And we actually saw this in the PWMA report that was issued this week. But one of the big things that we are seeing is the world changing and everyone embracing this thing called digital in the way that we act in our day-to-day lives, but importantly, how we're interacting with each other within our kind of working environments and with our clients. And this directly has an impact on clients' expectations on how they interact with their banks and, importantly, their bankers. And so there's an expectation then that these risk and reg and compliance challenges that we talked about before also need to go digital. And this is where the whole kind of RegTech kind of phenomenon, or the RegTech focus comes into play. And this is seen as the answer. But what do I mean by RegTech? So the HKMA defines RegTech as the use of technologies that enhance efficiency and all the effectiveness of risk management and regulatory compliance. So we're tech enabling all of those different functions. However, if I think about the future, and I put it with a slightly different lens, I think RegTech is just digital transformation that we're all trying to go through, but with this risk and compliance lens. And if you think about it in that way, it actually makes it slightly easier then to have conversations with kind of your businesses, your functions, but also you can then explain what you're doing with your clients. However, as I said before, one size doesn't fit all. And depending on your business, you're going to use it in slightly different ways. Now, across the world, we have different ways in which we kind of deliver and provide our products and services in the wealth management space. And whether or not you're a kind of a global private banker, you're a domestic wealth provider, there's different ways within which now customers are starting to expect or demand that they interact with you. And RegTech needs to now start to change or help change those activities. So they want to have global visibility that's online. They want to have seamless cross-border services that can be performed quickly and easily and be assured of compliance. They want their banker to have full transparency of their portfolio and to be able to provide kind of immediate investment ideas and decisions. And if we go to more kind of the domestic wealth management play, they still want to have this kind of ultra high touch personalized service, but they want all of this to be on a digital platform. They want to interact probably less in person in some cases. There still needs to be that kind of in-person interaction, but they want to be able to do a lot of the things that they do today, but through digital channels in a much more kind of virtual way. And then if you get into you kind of more of the affluent retail side, they want a complete end-to-end digital experience that is self-served. However, they still want to have kind of curated advice and content, and they want to have access to products. So it's a really, really interesting kind of world that we're evolving to. And by the way, all of those different customers all want to use WeChat and WhatsApp to communicate. So how do we get our hands around this? The other thing that's really interesting, I think, is the regulator. So obviously, we hear a lot about regulators around the world, and certainly in Hong Kong, that they want banks to do more with RegTech. We want to see greater adoption. But the interesting point here is they are also starting to use technology on themselves. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, I think, but the way that the regulator will want to interact with institutions in the future will become much more digital and much more direct. So if I go to my next slide, please. But where do we start, and where do COOs start? Well, the fintech and RegTech ecosystem is growing, but this in and itself, I think, can be overwhelming. Now, this is just a snapshot of some. This evolves continually. But where are banks starting to use it? And actually, I think, Paul, you already stole my thunder with your slide. So, we see institutions focusing on areas where we've got a lot of structured data. So things like AML, financial crime, risk, kind of data heavy. And actually, from the PWMA report and the reports that were issued by the HKMA this year, we see that institutions are going to invest and double down in those areas, but they're also going to start to look at things where there's less structured data, like conduct, like surveillance, where there's data, but we need to figure out how we get our arms around it. The other thing then is, how fast can we get these technologies on board? Because actually, and if you look at this slide here, there's a lot of technology out there already, but that isn't necessarily the thing that slows that slows organizations down. Actually, the thing that slows organizations down is our internal process. You try and get technology into your environment, it's all but impossible a lot of the time. We need to make sure that we're interacting and integrating with legacy technology environments, again, incredibly challenging. But I think one of the most important things that people underestimate is kind of changing the hearts and minds of the business and the functions, because people want the output. They want to have this new kind of virtual world, but they don't want to go through the change process to get there. So that slows down everything as well. And then kind of going into my final point, one of the other big things that I think is a driver for RegTech, and it will continue to be a big driver for RegTech in the future, and as was highlighted in the PWMA report, was cost is still seen as a key driver. Cost and efficiency was still seen as a key driver for the adoption of RegTech. However, if we look at leading adopters, they look beyond cost, and actually they consider more broad things, you know, the impacts and benefits on the organization, like enhancing the control environment, making our bankers' lives easier, helping them worry less, I guess, making compliance more robust. But the other, I think, which is it's a really unique thing that I think people don't tend to focus on very much, is looking at how it enhances that customer experience. And if you think about what I said at the start around digital transformation and what that means to institutions, you know, that it will be impacting the customer either directly where they're interacting with these digital channels, or indirectly when they're working with the banker, and the banker needs to have access to all of these tools so that they can, you know, deliver an enhanced customer experience. But either way, we need to deliver on this digital promise for sure, and it's not going away. You can take down my slide. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, James, for laying out what the future looks like. And for me, it's very, very exciting. I'd love to pose the first question to Florence, because it could be very exciting, but it could also be very overwhelming. So as you think about the future that James just rolled out, are you excited? Are you perplexed? How are you feeling?
Yeah, thank you, Paul and James. Obviously, you know, if we think back for a few years or even for a decade or two, obviously our industry went from, you know, having timestamp machines, paper tickets, orders, and those ages where we were just sort of all paper-driven business, to now at least we have systems to enter into an order. You know, but still we have a lot of compliance officer looking at, you know, the reports and picking samples and walk through them, and then banker, you know, advisors and bankers calling up compliance or myself and asking for, can I do this? What about that? You know, how do we think about the risk? So many policies and procedures for the advisors today. I mean, to Paul, your point, you know, there's a new regulation every 7 minutes or so. It's overwhelming for all of us. And in addition to that, client experience that James had mentioned, you know, we're trying to read the right disclosure for the right product class, because there are many of them. And then the clients on the other hand, like, you know, are you done yet? And so these are all things that we're now seeing today compared to the past. It's already a big evolution from the past way back when, but how do we think about ourselves in the future, in the next 5 years, 10 years? I mean, you know, in movies, you see flying cars, and as an imagination, as an industry, how do we imagine ourselves 5 years from now? Let's not, you know, 10 years is a long time, but let's think about that sort of picture in our mind for this panel, because I think it's important to instill a vision and a picture so that all of us can work towards that as a common goal. And so for myself, I thought about this topic last night. I said, you know, what do we need to change? I mean, we've, as all the banks have done, I think have invested quite a bit of money and time and resources on client-facing technology. We like to make the client experience better. Most of us have client-facing apps, websites, you know, trading capabilities, you know, some kind of an e-document, depending on where you are, some kind of a texting, you know, systems here and there. So those are like, you know, client-centric technology, which, you know, again, it's very important, right? Clients come first. Having said that, have we really transformed ourselves to think about advisors or bankers-centric technology strategy, i.e., how do we get to a point where there is a, you know, an app for advisors only, like, and it tracks all the way from you wake up every day, who do I prospect today? Somebody reminding, the app reminding us that, you have spoken to this prospect 3 weeks ago, time to remind their birthdays and all that, tracking your travel records, cross-border rules, limits, tracking all your expenses. And when you're about to do a trade, Paul, you and I just discussed this prior to the call, pop-ups, warnings, this is the thing, this is the limits, this is the disclosure you need to read, or even maybe better, automating the disclosures to the client at the other end, and have checked all the boxes and all the requirements, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also, internal limits, internal additional requirements that we sometimes impose on our bankers. And so that, I think even, and all the bankers here today are required to write call notes, right? Meeting notes. That app should be able to do that automatically once you, dictate on the phone. And so how do we get that? Do we want to get there as a dream? It's not that big a dream, really. It's not, think about the technology that is required to do that. It's not, I think easier than flying cars. And so if you see that as a goal, I think we should all try to get there, because I think that flying cars will come one day in our lifetime. And therefore, certainly in the next 5 years in our industry, we ought to get to a place where we have a client, a very advanced client facing technology, but in parallel, having a very advanced, front to back banker advisor centric app or technology. Because, we've chatted in our pre-calls, as a private banker, it's a lot of things. It's like growing relationship, thinking about their families, thinking about their troubles, thinking about what they need. That in itself is it's a lot of things. It's a huge job. And in addition to that, if we pile on a new regulation every single 7 minutes, it is an impossible mission. And therefore, it is important that we develop a strategy and implementation whereby we facilitate the private bankers and advisors in order for them to spend even more time thinking through the clients. And that's ultimately is our goal, right? In the industry, is we help our clients to get to a better future in their wealth management process. And so that would be my dream. It should not be a big dream. I hope all of you agree. It should be a very realistic dream that we have.
So I'm excited that you're excited, Florence. And yeah, I agree. It's, I tell my people as well, being an advisor, it's gotten harder, right? I think the job's gotten a lot harder, and it's exciting to see that there will be technology to come to help people. Jeff, maybe same question to you, seeing that future, is it the same level of excitement as Florence? I'm hoping it is. Kind of how do you think about it at Pictet?
Thanks, Paul. I think seeing your first presentation and the data and the stats, and then what James followed with, my original answer was that it was overwhelming, perplexing, and scary. But then having heard what Florence said, I must say I'm quite excited as well. When it comes to, I think to answer your question, when it comes to implementation, I guess there are a couple of pillars and different timelines. So maybe first speaking about what all of us have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, certainly as COOs. I would say most of us, and looking at this in the context of Hong Kong regulatory expectations, most of us have more than one role. We wear 2-3 hats, right? So we have a business role, a functional role, and very often some sort of regulated role. We've got CEs, ACEs, 72B managers, EOs. So we all feel the regulatory burden. What happens in practice, what happens day to day, often when we have regulatory matters that arise, they originate locally, and our reaction to it tends to be exactly that. It's reactive, it's tactical in nature. So I think that is certainly how things have been dealt with in the past. Lots of band-aid solutions, because basically we're given either short timelines or it had to happen yesterday from the regulator's perspective. We can't be very strategic about it. So thinking about RegTech solutions, I think if we look at it per se, can feel like a fairly insurmountable task, because when we look at the suite of potential solutions, they usually imply some level of investment, longer timelines, having to have some sort of strategic view. So I think what I would share with this panel is given we've had a bit of time to reflect on this in preparation for the panel. It can feel very overwhelming initially, but I think from a COO perspective, RegTech, the reg issues that we have, I think what I would encourage everybody to do is really think about RegTech as an enabler to solutions and to our regulatory issues, rather than an extra thing that becomes a worry and that we have to fathom and navigate our way through. Because if we reduce it back to first principles, it's essentially the same, right? We have an issue. We need to scope and figure out what that challenge is. We need to chart the course as to how to resolve the issue. We need to get stakeholder buy-in, and then eventually we move into execution and implementation. And I think it's through that channel and through that path that we also need to take a bit more of a forward-looking view on things and have those conversations with the head office, for example, and infuse this whole subject into the strategic view. And actually, from my perspective, it's not pulling up senior stakeholders and saying, hey, we need to have a conversation about RegTech. I think a lot of it resonates with what you have said previously, Paul, James, and Florence, which is that this needs to be integrated into, first of all, overall business strategy, and then digital priorities, if you will.
Yeah. So Jeff, maybe if I can stay with you. There was a few words that you said that caught my attention, and I think you used the word investment. I think I'll call it more cost, right? And we think about funding. So a lot of the times when we look at that future state that James said, we say, great, let's do it, right? Like that's what we want to look like. We all know realistically there's budgets, there's funding, there's discussions, there's stakeholders. How do you see that kind of dialogue or evolution happening when we think about funding a lot of these changes as well?
I guess putting it in the context of Pictet Group, where we've got ambitions for the region. We're still growing, and we're not big relative to other banks. So in terms of current approach to solutions, we can apply just more human capital, but it gets to a point where you're going to need to implement digital solutions to address regulatory demands. The supervisors, our regulators, are also doing that. So it's happening on the other side. So in some respects, if we don't keep up, at some point we're going to get left behind. So I think that's an important consideration. I would say Pictet is not at the front of the pack in terms of leading the way with respect to digital transformation, and we're not dissimilar to lots of pure play wealth managers. I think a lot of these solutions, the digital approach tends to originate from where we need to address scale and deal with volume, right? So it's in the retail core affluent space. And then because of the imperative expectations from clients internally, the need to be more efficient, it moves up the value chain. So I think with that, in that respect, we at Pictet can benefit from, I guess, what we would term as the 2.0 solutions. There's market knowledge and experience, and I think certainly in Hong Kong, it's really encouraging to see that the regulator is taking the initiative to share insights. I think this is certainly in terms of the tone, the willingness to showcase solutions, to bring partners to the table, to say, look, this is what's happening in the market. It's very different space and different approach to how they've been positioning a lot of regulatory topics. So I think we can embrace that. And I think this is where earlier I mentioned that transition from tactical to strategic. We need to start those conversations or have those conversations and drive those conversations with the senior stakeholders in the head office. So we need to move away from the budgeting process where it's always short term, and what's at the top of the list, ironically, it's the reg mandatory stuff. And yet we say if we want to have a strategic conversation and have funding for RegTech solutions, if you put it that way, it might sort of percolate its way further down the list. So I think what's really critical and important, and this is what's starting to evolve and happen at our organization, is that RegTech, if you want to label it that, just needs to be integrated into our digital strategy. We need to get involved in the conversation. And when I say we, it's stakeholders here in Hong Kong or Asia. There are a lot of perspectives and there's a lot of cutting edge things which are happening because of regulatory change and regulatory expectations, which are often set at a much higher bar here than elsewhere. So we need to be part of those conversations. We can drive pilots here. We can have incubators for solutions here, rather than does it have to always originate from New York or Geneva or Zurich or the UK in London. We need to be crystal clear on our needs, and I think this is where we can leverage the fact that we do wear more than one hat. So hopefully what we say can resonate and relate to senior stakeholders, not just the compliance lead that needs to back it, but also the business head, the person in IT, the person in operations. So it's that entire end-to-end group of stakeholders that need to be on board. And we need to drive and sell a very clear benefits case. And these are the topics that resonate that I think all of you have mentioned. It frees up time to do more business. It's a lot more strategic. We can reduce costs. It can give us benefits in terms of efficiencies, people-wise, all the stuff that James said earlier.
That's great. No, I think you laid that out very, very well, Jeff. Thank you. Florence, maybe if you think about it, just Goldman Sachs angle as well, right? We're running businesses. Businesses have expenses. Right, we know that we always need to balance, right? We need to balance kind of what we want to do with how do we do it and how fast do we do it? How do you kind of think about that from a GS angle? Yeah.
Thanks. I think maybe it's we use the words investments and then we use the word cost, and maybe we should think about it from a different angle. Is if we don't do this, what might be the cost? I.e., bankers, advisors leaving, younger generations not joining the industry, regulatory audit issues resulting in costs, compliance issues, compliance headcount, compliance resources to handle all the surveillance on a sample basis. And all those are costs you have been already incurring today. Because it's as we all struggle through the younger generation bankers, this is a hard industry. The client side is hard. The paperwork side of the things is even harder. And so all that, if there's no real way of quantifying these things, but if you put some assumptions around it, they add up to some huge cost too. And therefore, it's more like thinking about it as if we don't have the technology built up and invest, the costs will continue to be there on the flip side and continue to grow. Which it's really which side you want to be on. It's the same cost really. And so I think if we think of that from that perspective, then the answer seems to be obvious. Having said that, to all of you's comments, it's not as easy. This is a huge request and a huge ask. The global, as we are, some of us are operating global, global firms where it's headquarter centric. It's a prioritization process across 5,000 things in the world. But, I think most, even global firms see that, it's everyday Bloomberg news that they all see that Asia being the growth market and continue to invest in advisors headcount, bankers headcount in the region. And from that perspective, it is an investment mode for the region. So that helps in terms of asking for dollars from the headquarters. And more importantly, the Asian market is different. I mean, if you look at the United States business, they don't trade as many things as voluminous as we do here. Even in the European markets, they trade, but they don't trade as much as we do here. And so I think in our pitch to our headquarters, not only that they're investing in our region from a growth perspective, we also have to educate our headquarters that our business is fundamentally different from the rest of the world. And therefore the investment and the opportunity and the strategy ought to be not completely different, because nobody in the headquarters would say, hey, why don't you do your own thing and we'll do our own thing. I mean, I've never heard that in Goldman Sachs, but we will just have to adjust the strategy to tailor-made to the Asian business as we continue to grow bigger, right? As we become a higher percentage of our global business, we would be able to get more attention and dollars that way, if we are able to perform and deliver the results. And so it's really a continuous chicken and egg question. But
Yeah.
I think if we don't start, we don't ask, we will never get there. So the key is for all of us here on this panel and all the other business stakeholders in the audience, start to ask, start to talk, and start to petition. And one day this will happen. And hopefully that's not 10 years from now, that's like 3 years. And I said, I think as we put our heads around it, and we unite, and we all talked about this prior to this panel, there should be some ways to find solutions in a more centralized manner across the industry. Because again, this technology is not that complicated. And therefore, could we scale up the impact at the industry level to find a common solution? And then each firm can tailor make and all that, but there can be some core foundation somewhere, who can, provider somewhere who can provide a core solutions to most of us. And so that's, how I would think about priority. It's I don't think it's a choice. And it is just you have to have a parallel strategy for internal workflows to client-facing technologies. It has to be parallel. As you think through a new client-facing app or tool, you ought to think about what does that mean for our advisors? Are they just doing more paperwork in the back and pretend to be digital from a client-facing perspective? I mean, we cannot pretend for too long. And that's what we have been doing, right? We pretend, okay, dear client, it's great and all that. And then in the back end, it's like, it's all paper. And so I think we ought to change that, because I think we can only handle so much of that paperwork.
No, I 100% agree. And it's exciting. Like I said, it's exciting to hear kind of what could change. And I think what I heard from you is, we need to make sure people understand we're different, right? As far as the business that we do here. And it's difficult, right? It's more and more difficult to be an advisor, especially here in Hong Kong, right? So what can we do to make that easier? What can we do to protect our people, right? And I think myself, even as a market manager, that's something that keeps me up at night, right? Because I know people are putting in their time and efforts, and they're working so hard, and with one mistake, right, with the environment they're in, right, that could derail them in their career. So it's exciting to see what's coming.
Yeah.
So
and by the way,
Florence,
that's the other point is besides obviously helping our advisors and bankers, we should not lose sight of the fact that all of this we're doing is also for the client's protection. And so deep down, whilst we said, it's, we're internally, investing for the internal workflow, it is all ultimately leads to client protections, better client experience, better client protection. And so we pitch it that way, then it's the same as investing into a new client app. We should not have to differentiate between the two. Yeah.
No, 100%. So James, one of the things Florence said, was like, okay, which providers, right? Which technologies out there? Is there some way banks can get comfortable with a few names, and can we, see if we can work together to obviously make that better? Yeah, you obviously have seen a lot of these different providers as far as what they can do. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that. You had that big chart that had all of those different companies, but help us navigate, what's interesting, what's out there now.
By the way, that chart, even though I put it up, whatever it was 15 minutes ago, is out of date already, because there's so many more that have just come. One of the things, I think from what Florence has just been saying, I think we've now got the pitch for our business case for our next RegTech as well, by the way. Look, there's so many out there, as we were talking about, and there's some really interesting innovation. And there's global players. There's a lot of homegrown talent actually in Hong Kong. And the ecosystem is getting bigger and bigger, and much more, I think, dynamic in the way that it's starting to interact with not just the institutions, but the regulators, and trying to share ideas, and they're all trying to solve very kind of specific challenges, these risk and compliance and regulatory challenges that we talked about. So, I'll reference some here, but obviously, there's a lot of kind of RegTech challenges, hackathons, that sort of stuff that Jeff made reference to as well. Actually, that we, worked with some of the regulators this year to kind of showcase. There's vendors that are really trying to address the onboarding challenge, as an example. So, that KYC onboarding challenge, like Check, that are really interesting, and they use some really interesting technology around, image recognition and those sorts of things. The other one that I think is really interesting, just to name a couple of names, around that kind of cross-border sales compliance. You know, and we talked about the fact that you want to be able to, the banker needs to be able to say, right, I'm going to go to this country. What can I do? How can I interact with my clients? So there's a product called Apex that's out there that's really interesting, and I think some of the institutions in Hong Kong are actually using that. And again, these are all names that were in some of the RegTech challenges. But the areas that I think will have like tremendous impact on the market are those providers that, and Florence, I think you said it well, that kind of within the internal workings, the internal processes. So they might not necessarily be people might not necessarily be directly aware that they're using RegTech. It's just kind of helping people's lives, make their lives a little bit easier. So the super interesting ones that I think will basically help our compliance teams kind of do their job better, but also ideally reduce their stress levels, are things like you know, having the ability to completely transcribe conversations across multiple Asian languages when you're going in and out of different languages, but you can still identify that it's one person talking, and then having the supporting analytics to support that as well. And there's a homegrown solution provider here called Finolabs, which is really cool, and they're working with a lot of the institutions that I'm sure are in the audience today. The other one that I think is pretty interesting is being able to log and record all of your digital communication. And you know, I have this conversation. Paul and I had this conversation, I think Jeff as well, around, you know, all of our customers and all of our clients want to interact through different digital channels: WeChat, Signal, WhatsApp, Teams. You know, we're all using different channels, and there's vendors out there that can pull all of this stuff together into one place and then hand you back those data points to say, right, now here's your data. You know, you can do your analysis on it and make sure that you're complying. So again, another homegrown vendor called Leap Expert. So, you know, there's a number out there that I think are super exciting. But each organization, I will go back to a bit of a caveat. Obviously, each organization needs to go through their own kind of process, their own due diligence, and everyone's going to have a unique problem statement. I completely agree, though, that we do need to find that commonality, that common ground, and maybe share and compare a little bit more. But to me, then that's about maybe more participation with the ecosystem, where we all just come together and talk more, actually, because believe you me, the RegTech vendors would love more interaction with certainly the big brand names, but more banks, so that they can refine their solutions to make it better for the market at large. So that's what I would say.
Great. So I have to be honest, the term RegTech, I think I probably only learned it about 4 or 5 months ago, right? I think I'm behind the curve. But then I was talking to James, and he used a term that I only learned last week, and that's subtech. And James, maybe you can elaborate for our participants watching the panel. What is subtech, and how is that going to get plugged in to RegTech?
Well, this to me, actually, I mean, I know we want to protect our clients more, and I know that we want to make our bankers and our lives easier from a risk and compliance perspective. But the supervisors are also investing in themselves. They're all digitizing their operations, but they're also digitizing the way that they want to interact with all of you. So basically, in the future, what that means is they're going to come in, they want to do reviews. They're just going to plug in through digital channels, which is pretty scary, actually, I think. And, you know, then they will be able to make all sorts of comparisons. They'll have a better understanding of the market, and they'll have a far greater population of information and data that they can then, you know, discharge their supervisory kind of obligations. So this is the thing I think that's going to drive actually RegTech adoption even faster, because it's not about keeping up with the market. It's about keeping up with the regulators and the supervisors. And that's the thing that I think will be super compelling when we go back into our HQs and say, well, actually, if we don't do this, we're going to be in trouble.
I think that's a great point. Maybe Florence, just on you, if you think about that future of, you know, being plugged into supervisory, as a market manager myself, I'm excited about it, right? Because I want to make sure that obviously we're running a very compliant organization with the regulations. as we know today, it's phone call checking. We're listening to recordings, right? And if we have a lot of this data and they understand the changes of what's happening as well, we can actually work a lot closely together to be able to operate businesses in the right way. How do you think about that, Florence?
Yeah, I think if we, sort of continue this, momentum, I think we should be able to get to a stage where majority of the sort of controls or mechanisms are preventative rather than detective. And therefore, from even a supervisory perspective, today we spend a lot of time dealing with issues, exceptions. And why? I mean, I don't know why it's a lot of energy and anger and emotions. And so I think, if we move towards a more preventative approach, to the extent it's still commercially sort of, I think we should still strike a balance of not making things too prescriptive and too hard for our business. I think, from a supervisory perspective, we can spend time on other things that are not so sort of, transactionally related. I think as a supervisor today, we all got bogged down with a transaction, a tape phone, a misstated order trail of something. But I think as supervisor in supervising this business, I think to really try to understand where the client issues are and where the client angers are, it takes more than just looking at those transactions and records. And if we can free ourselves up and spend time with our advisors and bankers, their struggles, their motivations, their incentives, I think we're going to have a better industry and business, and clients will be ultimately benefited from this. And so I think SupTech is SupTech. What do you call it? It's a great idea. It's SupTech. Yeah, that's right. I think it's a great idea, but I do think that if we get to a more preventative sort of platform, I think hopefully supervisors can spend more time on sort of more behavioral type quality, quality time with our advisors and clients.
Yeah, no, fully agree. Jeff, maybe last question to you. How do you think about SupTech being plugged into RegTech and the future of what holds?
I think the two things are converging. I very much like what James said, which is I think if we as banks do not adopt and integrate technology solutions into our risk management and compliance, then the regulator is going to do it for us. And right now they're being polite about it. They're being supportive. And I think we ought to embrace that. I think in terms of where we're going to go for that roadmap, it is some ways away, but we need to drive those conversations now. It's all the things that Florence said earlier. But overall, I think it's really exciting because to get to a place where organizationally, by default, we are regulatory compliant. The only times we get involved in dealing with regulatory issues when there's lots of hair on an issue and it's really not normal, I think is an exciting place to aspire to be. But it's going to take a lot of work to get there. And then the other thing we mentioned earlier is these sorts of solutions lend themselves to collaboration. So we don't all come up with our own interpretation of what the regulator needs. So with that convergence, with a common platform, that's a pretty exciting future from my perspective.
No, I agree. In the closing, I would say financial institutions like ourselves, we hate interpretation, right? We'd rather it be kind of a very standard process for banks and to be able to follow as well. I would just say this: if you're an advisor listening to this panel, you should feel very excited, right? I think that's I want to say there's hope, right? I think everyone recognizes the challenges that are out there, and I think a lot of these solutions that are coming to the market, once they get analyzed and looked at and then adopted, hopefully it's going to be helping, not only us, but it's also going to be helping the industry, right? I think that's one of the main points for us is to make sure that we continue to grow the wealth management industry here in Hong Kong in a compliant way, and to give our people the tools that they need to be able to do that. I knew it would be tough for the COO panel. We wanted to try to make this as dynamic as we could. I just want to say a big thank you to the panelists, Florence, Jeff, and James. You brought excitement back. I think we're the last panel of the day, so hopefully people feel that excitement. And looking forward to celebrating with everyone tonight at the dinner. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.